Winter Quarter ReadAlouds. Today we have Sandra Gurvis as our first presenter. She's the author of 15 books and a longtime Columbus resident and a lifetime Ohio resident. A major aspect of her work has been on the Vietnam protests and their after effects. Particularly relevant to today's political situation is her recent nonfiction title, Where Have All the Flower Children Gone? She's going to read from that today. And it was 5 years in the making. It's a nonfiction title, so there was a lot of research that went into that. It covers all facets of the Vietnam era, from tracking the student protests and the conservative movements to comparing the controversy surrounding the Vietnam to the Middle East. And her other book that she's reading from today, The Pipe Dreamers, is a fictional exploration of the late 1960s and the early 1970s. Mostly set in the small college town of Hampton, Ohio, which some of you may know of. Okay, she brings to life a colorful, complicated era that made a huge impact on our collective memory and culture. Sandra Gurvis.
Thank you. Okay, let's pass around these quizzes and the answers there. But if you know the answers, you get 2 free books. Nobody's ever been able to get the answers. Yeah, there's the front page, and then the second page has the answers. Yeah, some of them have the answers on the back. They've been copied at different stages and whatnot. I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of both my books, starting with The Pipe Dreamers, which is my novel. And The Pipe Dreamers, actually, I wrote. I was a child of the 60s, actually more like a young adult of the 60s. I was in college when students were shot at Kent State. I was at Miami, which the fictional town of Hampton, Ohio, resembles Oxford, Ohio, a lot. And I basically wanted to write the book after I was out of college, and people were kind of like, nobody wants to read about a bunch of hippies. It's not what we want to hear. And I'm like, yes, but I must write this book. And to make a long story short, because I know I want to do a lot of reading today, I wrote a good portion of this book in this library. In I think it was like the late 70s and early 80s. So it's nice for me to be able to come back here and read this published novel of mine, which was 20 years in the making. So a little bit note about that. And Ruth pretty much explained the situation behind the Flower Children book. And the only other interest, which I will read from also, the only other item of interest about that book is that I was going to finish it in 2000. It was due to be finished in 2000. And September 11th happened, and a divorce happened in my life. And I never got to finish it on time, which was, as sad as 9/11 was, it was in a way a blessing in disguise, because I finished this book after 9/11, just as the United States was getting into war with Iraq. So around that period. So that was kind of a good thing for this book. Otherwise, it probably would have never had as much information in it as it does now. So let me get started with my reading. I'm going to start with my novel, The Pipe Dreamers. And this is a new one, because I've read so much from the other one that it's like all ruined, which sounds kind of strange. I'm going to read a couple chapters from that one to begin with. On the evening of the May, and this is in 1960, I believe it's the spring of 1969, just as the student protest movement was getting started. And this book basically traces the year 1969-1970, which was the seminal year in the Vietnam protest movement. And my character gets involved in all aspects of it. But this is just as she was starting to get involved. On the evening of the May Music Fest, Julia Brandon sat with her sorority, wondering why she was there. The air was unbearably close, despite the cloudless, pink-streaked dust. And Julia sweated, even though she wore a lightweight dress. Yet with her dark hair, sea forest eyes, and satiny skin, she looked cool and composed. But it was a deception, like most of her life decades. The Music Fest, which fell on the last weekend before finals, usually served as a barometer by which Julia measured her year. When she was a freshman, she regarded this tradition, in fact the entire alumni reunion weekend, with enthusiasm and awe. She'd been a pledge, and the older girls seemed so polished and self-assured, handling the alumni Beta Gamma Pis with charm and facility. When Julia was a sophomore, she was thrilled to be part of the festivities. She helped organize tea for alumni and their husbands and led the sorority in its theme song during the music fest. She felt so proud standing with the BGPs, one of the top sororities on campus. Now in her junior year, Julia was less enthusiastic. She noticed chinks in the girls' behavior, Barb's mask with delicate laughs, whispered comments not meant for all ears. And she had a growing certainty that her presence in the sorority had been a case of mistaken identity. During Rush Week last fall, an outstanding freshman candidate, a National Merit Scholar, and former prom queen had been dropped from consideration when her sisters learned her last name was Goldberg. Would they have accepted Julia had they known about the Stein Julia's grandfather had excised before debarking on Ellis Island? Which was why Julia's roommate Valerie Stasic was as refreshing as a spring charging through a desert. Valerie had been assigned to the room at the beginning of the spring quarter. Nancy, her predecessor and Julia's former big sis, had dropped out of the sorority due to family problems, BGP lingo for knocked up. Poor Nancy had been grist for the sorority gossip mill, although Julia refused to discuss the matter with anyone. Look, you're a sorority chick and I'm a hippie, Valerie had announced, plunking her carpet bag down on the empty bag. And the goddamn administration thinks it can suppress me by putting me in a dorm full of Greekoids. As long as you do your thing and I do mine, they can continue with their delusions. Then Valerie proceeded to plaster the side of the room with blacklight Peter Max posters and pictures of President Nixon grinning under the captions, "Would you buy a used car from this man?" and "Dick Nixon before he dicks you." Rather than being appalled or even slightly offended by Valerie's brash dress and language, Julia was fascinated. Valerie radiated spontaneity and humor, two things Julia's life lacked. Soon the girls became friends, although they never ate at the same time or went anywhere together. An unspoken agreement to maintain their separate lives made their relationship almost clandestine. Valerie was careful not to push her radical ideas on Julia, although she used any conversational opening to espouse her beliefs on ending the war in Vietnam, free love, and the legalization of marijuana and LSD. Then one day at the student center, she stopped Julia in the cafeteria line and introduced her to Adrian. Julia had never met a man interested in a woman's mind before, although his satirical humor was often biting, and his discourses on Lenin versus Marxist philosophies and surrealistic versus street theater confused her. The sorority she at least understood. So when Valerie and Adrian invited her to participate in an anti-Vietnam demonstration to be held during this May Music Fest, Julia gently refused. She told him of her obligation to sit with her sorority. Besides, she asked herself, what did she have to gain by refusing to stand for the national anthem? A chance to antagonize the administration? To be ostracized by her sisters? The last thing Julia wanted was to make a spectacle of herself. Adrian volleyed a witticism about Julia's lack of commitment, and Valerie shrugged, her impish mouth a straight line, her stone-washed blue eyes downcast. Now, turning her attention to the crowd, Julia told herself she was foolish to feel guilty. She'd only known Valerie and Adrian 2 months. Relationships and loyalties in the sorority had taken years to establish. BGP wasn't perfect, but it was familiar. Be honest with yourself, Julia, she thought. Where would you be on this big, lonely campus of 12,000 plus bodies without your Greek security blanket of ready-made friends and dates? Not that the dates were much, mostly betas and sig-Fs who tried to slip sweaty hands under her skirt and sweater as soon as they were alone. But at least they reassured her that she was attractive, although she often wondered why they never bothered to get to know her first. There was a mating ritual, and Julia nearly always anticipated the boys next to her. Lately, it depressed her so much she confined her longings to a handsome profile glimpsed on the slant walk, or a nice build in the back row of class, where Julia rarely sat. In addition to being pretty and poised, BGPs were expected to maintain good grades, so they stayed in the front of the room next to each other, of course. From her vantage point at the topmost bleacher, Julia viewed a scene straight out of Norman Rockwell. Administrators, leading citizens from the adjoining village of Hampton, and assorted honorees sat at the front of the steps leading to the portico of the Performing Arts Center. Behind the VIPs stood the singing groups and soloists, resplendent in long flowered dresses or suits or matching robes. On the side lawn to the right was a band, clad in military-looking uniforms of red and yellow, the school colors. On the left sat the orchestra in somber gray. The audience, too, reflected Rockwellian decorum. Alumni lounged in folding chairs or blankets on the grass. Some strolled through the adjoining full-bloom formal gardens. Their children stayed close, undoubtedly discouraged from racing about by the heat. The rest, undergraduates, grad students, and an occasional professor, sat directly on the lawn below Julia. Only sororities and fraternities had the privilege of bleachers and a total view of the goings-on. Julia's little sis, Betsy, leaned over and said, "It's beastly, isn't it?" Betsy waved her program back and forth, a makeshift fan. "I thought it'd cool down when the sun began to set." Julia examined the strand of what once was her perfectly straight, shorely flip and sighed. "I'd say the humidity's about 95%. She started to ask Betsy if she could borrow her hair straightening iron when they got back to the dorm. But Lydia, president-elect of the sorority, shushed the group, telling them the program was about to begin. Julia searched for Adrian and Valerie during President Carroll's opening speech about the greatness of the university and its tradition of excellence. She didn't spot them until just before the band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner. They sat a few feet away from the bleachers while the audience rose in mass. Julia had a good view and could see the five of them: Adrian, Valerie, an overweight couple with an American flag draped around their shoulders, and an aesthetic-looking blonde holding a sign bearing a blue and white peace symbol. Adrian and Valerie waved placards labeled "Stop the War" and "War is not healthy for children and other living things." With a mixture of relief and disappointment, Julia realized the demonstration was doomed. Not only did their distance from the portico render them practically invisible to the crowd, but they had been swallowed up by the standing, singing audience. With a small number in poor location, no one would notice the demonstrators unless they really looked. Julia began to check out a groovy-looking guy a few rows below her, but a blur of blue caught her eye. She leaned forward, astonished, as 3 Hampton sheriffs approached the protesters. Her first thought was, what are the police doing here? Valerie and the others aren't breaking the law. Yet 2 officers seized Adrian and the couple by the scruff of their necks, dragging them towards an unmarked idling van. The protesters offered no resistance. The blonde girl followed peacefully. But Valerie's reaction was different. Struggling violently, she kicked and shouted at the 3rd sheriff, a heavy-set, bulky man. In his attempt to restrain her, he hit her in the face. A ribbon of steel flashed across his fingers. Iron knuckles, Julia realized in horror. She'd seen prison movies where guards used them to torture inmates. Little did she know that they'd be employed on her own roommate. Valerie's outcry alerted the audience that something was amiss. Heads began to turn and bodies shifted, making it difficult for Julia to see. But she couldn't miss the blood streaming from her roommate's cheek, nose, and mouth. Bright red rivulets ran down her neck, staining her loose cotton top. And it wasn't cushioned by celluloid like film clips of the Chicago riots or the makeup used in movies. It was real. The policeman shoved Valerie in the back of the van with the others, jumping in the driver's seat and slamming the door. The van jounced down the gravel side road, just as the band finished the last phrase of the Star-Spangled Banner. Julia was stunned. The altercation had been so sudden and so cruel, and Valerie's and the others hadn't done anything wrong. Pointing in the direction of the retreating van, Julia shouted, "I can't believe it. Did you see what just happened?" Several sisters stared at Julia. Betsy said, "No, I didn't, but you better sit down. Everyone is looking at you." "I don't care." Julia was filled with a helpless rage. She wanted to say bastards, but didn't dare. "Those cops just brutalized my friends for exercising their freedom of speech. This is America, not a dictatorship. They had no right to do that." Betsy laid firm hands on Julia's shoulders, forcing her to sit like the others. "Calm down, Julia. If you're referring to that crazy roommate of yours, she probably asked for it. You should have requested a transfer. There are plenty of empty rooms on my floor." But if Betsy hadn't been her closest friend in the sorority, Julia would have pulled a Valerie and told her where to get off. How dare Betsy talk that way about someone she didn't even know? Julia fumed while the Hayes Choraleers stepped out to the portico and began a tune about being on top of the world.